Rankin, and I'm here to talk about my work in progress, Nina, The Lost Diary of Nina Gabriellovich. What would you do if you and your friends found an old diary written by someone you'd never heard of? Would you open it? We did. Would you read it?
Oh, yeah.
We did that too. What would you do next? Here's the story of what we did. It all started when my friend Rudy Bowling inherited a cardboard box full of books after his grandfather passed away in the 1980s. One of those books was a handwritten diary kept in 1924 by a 13-year-old girl named Nina Gabriellovich. Rudy had no idea who that was, but he read the diary anyway. Soon he became fascinated with the life it revealed. He shared it with a few of his other friends, including me. And just like Rudy, we were drawn into her life from the very first page.
Tuesday, January 1, 1924. Mademoiselle and I, her real name is Fräulein Sophie Pruschutz, went to church from 10 till 11 o'clock. I like the Catholic churches because the altars are so fancy and beautiful, and the Protestant churches are so plain. I kneeled till I about wore my knees out. It was very cold. I finished reading The Three Musketeers and have started The Hound of the Baskervilles by A. Conan Doyle. It is very exciting. Mademoiselle and I took the Cass Avenue bus for Palmer Park. We passed our new house. We reckoned that it takes 15 minutes to go home in the bus from my school. We walked through the forests and looked at the swans in the park. My feet got icy cold, and I was glad to get back into our warm parlor. Miss Shover telephoned again to say that we are not to come to the new house till Thursday. That is the third time she has telephoned about the house.
Reading the diary, we quickly realized that Nina was no ordinary teenager, although it would be a little while before we realized just how unusual she actually was. She was part of the affluent class of 1920s Detroit, Michigan, which was enjoying boom times thanks to the new automotive industry. Her father conducted the local symphony orchestra. Her mother had her own career as a singer. This was almost all the information that Nina revealed about her family in the diary. Miss Shover, who turned out to be aptly named, was her father's domineering secretary. But Nina's constant companion was her nanny, Sophie Pruschutz, who she affectionately called Mademoiselle or Fräulein in the diary. Here's a photo of Nina and Mademoiselle in 1923, just before the start of Rudy's diary. Both of Nina's parents traveled frequently with their busy performance schedules. In fact, we didn't even meet them until the diary was a week into 1924.
Monday, January 7th. Father arrived at the house at 10 minutes to 9. The minute he put his nose in the house, he said it was too hot, and I had to turn off every radiator he laid his eyes on. It is really funny. Mother and father left the 28th of December at different stations, but at the same time. They arrived this morning at different stations and almost at the same time. Mother got here at 9 o'clock. They are both delighted with the house. I practiced and played in the garden. It was very much warmer today. There is a bird's fountain, 3 stone benches, one of which is a sort of arbor and will be covered with roses in the spring, and a sundial in the garden. Mother let me go to Father's piano recital. It was so wonderful. Father gave 1 encore after the first group, 2 encores after the second group, and 3 after the last. The people were still applauding. I didn't get to bed until 11:30 p.m.
As we read the diary, we became drawn into Nina's world. Her happy life at home and school, her adventures traveling in Europe, her troubles with math class, her first crush. It was a window into the life of a young woman from a different era, and we had a clear view through it. we were often impressed with how well this 13-year-old girl wrote, and with her eagerness to capture the beauty she saw in the world around her.
Sunday, January 20. It is a beautiful morning. The sun is just streaming into my sitting room and making very cheerful and bright. The snow is very deep and glistens and sparkles in the sun. In the afternoon, we went to the concert. It was lovely. Mr. Abbas and Madame Ostrovska played the violoncello and the harp together. We walked home. It was twilight. The houses were lighted up, the snow was bright and crisp, and the full moon shone golden in the sky.
Nina seemed unspoiled by her life of privilege, and her diary entries revealed an eye for detail. As we read the diary, we developed a bond with the girl, as if she was the main character in a favorite new novel that we'd all read. This created a sort of paradox. She was a stranger, and as far as we knew then, she would always be a stranger. And yet, we knew her life in detail, as if the words in the diary were written directly to us. It was like having a pen pal from another time. She recorded the negative aspects of her life in the diary, as well as the positive ones. For example, when she got in trouble or labored in vain over piano lessons, which drove her piano teacher crazy, especially since her father was a noted musician. And then, in March of 1924, Nina had an experience that any one of us in 2021 can appreciate. She was forced to self-isolate for 3 weeks because of a medical crisis.
Friday, March 14. When I was going out to play, I said to Mademoiselle, "Look, I believe I am going to have chicken pox. My throat itches." I said it in a jesting manner, but she took it seriously and examined me. I had pink spots all over my neck, but they didn't itch. From that minute on, all the excitement began. I undressed and found I was covered with pink yellowy spots. Father arrived at the house at about 8:30. He was immediately informed of what had happened and was quite nervous. Tuesday, March 18. I had no fever, so I got up for breakfast. Afterwards, Mother came in and solemnly announced that they had thought perhaps I had smallpox. She looked as if she expected me to be greatly surprised, so I only said, "Oh, really?"
But this was no laughing matter. There was a smallpox outbreak going on in the Midwest in 1924 and 25. In fact, only a few months later, Nina wrote in the diary, quote, "At my music lesson, Mr. Morse informed me that today there were 78 new cases of black smallpox and 12 deaths, most of it around the west part of the city about where we live. That is encouraging, I must say." End quote. And of course, memories of the deadly 1918 flu epidemic were still fresh in everyone's minds. Fortunately, Nina's quarantine was mostly uneventful. The worst that happened was that she caught a bad cold and had to miss 3 weeks of school instead of just 2. She read a lot of books, played dominoes with Mademoiselle, and wrote in her diary.
Thursday, April 10. I am so sick of a house that I would like not to see one for a few weeks. I was sick 2 weeks with the chicken pox and 1 week tomorrow with a cold. That is plenty for me, and I have missed all my fun during the spring vacation. I get so fidgety that I could climb 1,000,000 trees for exercise. In the evening, everyone went to the concert. I could have gone if I hadn't been sick. Johnny Morse is still in bed with a high temperature, but his spring vacation starts now.
Out of curiosity, I decided, what the heck? I'd try to see if I could find out who she was. This was before the internet, 1992. At the time, the odds of finding a random girl who lived in Detroit 70 years before seemed pretty remote. But her father was at least locally famous, and she had that distinctive last name. So it seemed possible I might find something. Well, I found something. It was this entry from Webster's Biographical Dictionary on her father, Osip Gabriellovich. We knew it was the same man because she mentions his unusual first name on February 22nd in the diary.
We trampled in enormous letters the words Clara in the snow on Rudy's side of the house, and the same thing with Osip on Fatih's side of the house. They went to the concert.
Awesome. Funny name. Surely there have never been two Osip Gabrielloviches in the history of the world. This had to be Nina's father. I couldn't believe it. I was so amazed at finding any real-world reference to Nina outside of the diary that I completely overlooked what was, by far, the most significant detail in the entry. This line at the end.
That's awful.
I photocopied the page, put the book back on the shelf, and went on about my day. Later that night, prior to calling Rudy and telling him what I'd found, I glanced at the page again. And that's when it finally registered. That's when I realized S.L. Clemens was probably that S.L. Clemens. This was our first inkling of who Nina really was. But the important thing to remember is, by the time I saw the name S.L. Clemens, we had already been reading the diary for 4 months.
Wow.
I was not a Mark Twain scholar at the time. If I had been, I would have noticed the name S.L. Clemens a whole lot sooner. Like most people, I knew something about Twain's work, something about his personality, a little about his personal life, but nothing at all about his family. But now we knew Mark Twain was Nina's grandfather. And her father was famous too. Osip Gabriellovich was a Russian child prodigy who gave his first piano concert in Berlin at the age of 18. He studied with the legendary pianist and composer Lecheditsky in the 1890s. That's where he met Clara Clemens, Mark Twain's daughter. And the Clemens family was living in Europe, and Clara, an aspiring musician, also studied with the maestro. Osip and Clara had an on-again, off-again romance and finally married in 1909 at the end of Twain's life. The family spent the first few years of Nina's life in Germany, where Osip was director of the Munich Orchestra. There was a little community of musicians and their families living outside of Munich, including Leopold Stokowski, a family friend. Here's a photo of Nina, around 4 years old, balancing on Stokowski's hand. Stokowski is probably more famous these days since he was the conductor of Disney's famous film Fantasia. But at the time, Osip was almost as famous, first as a pianist and later as a conductor. You could say the name Gabriellovich and expect a certain percentage of people to know who you were talking about. When World War I broke out, the family was still in Munich, and Germany and Russia were on opposite sides of the war. In fact, Osip was arrested as a suspected Russian spy. The family used their connections to get him out of prison, and they quickly returned to America. In 1918, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra asked Gabriellovich to become its conductor. He agreed on the condition that the city build a proper home and performance center for the orchestra. The result, Orchestra Hall, is still standing today. And that's how Nina came to Detroit.
Saturday, February 9. I put on bloomers, a midi, and 2 pairs of gloves. I took with me a few extra things, among which was my camera. At 9:10, the car came for me. The crowd were Miss Voss, Harriet and Mary Hughes, Gina Mary and Edith Jane Scotton, Rosalie Kahn, and I. We immediately started to coast. It was very steep, and every bit of it was ice with a thin layer of snow. We took some round black trays and coasted down sitting on them. We kept turning around and around. We looked like crickets sitting on dolls' dishes. Several times the sleds turned too quickly and we were dumped in the snow. We had lunch at 12:15. It was delicious, and we were certainly hungry enough. We must have gone down about 50 times. We took some pictures, and every time we would start to walk up, we slid halfway down again. It was so icy. At 4:30, much to our regret, we got our things together and drove home. It was the nicest time I have had in many years, and I never can thank Harriet enough for inviting me.
Once we knew who she was, I had to find out the rest of the story. Through Rudy's family, we discovered how Rudy got the diary in the first place. It turned out that Rudy's grandfather was Al Matthews, a well-known attorney in Los Angeles in the 1950s and 60s. Being close to Hollywood, Al had plenty of celebrity clients, including, for example, the Barrymore family of actors. Al was Nina's friend as well as her attorney at the end of her life. As a result, he inherited her personal effects after her death. Rudy's grandmother Emily surely knew who Nina was, but she had passed away in the late 1980s. By that point, most of the family knew Al had some vague connection to Mark Twain's family, but the details had been forgotten. Osip Gabriellovich had likewise faded into historical obscurity. Unless you were a scholar of classical music, Detroit history, or the Clemens family, the name Gabriellovich was forgotten. There were no other diaries in the box of Al's books, but there were a handful of other books with Nina's name in them. She had inscribed and sometimes dated them in handwriting that we now instantly recognized. In this way, we learn that Nina had lived until at least the 1960s. The little girl had grown up. Like I said, I was not a student of Mark Twain when we found the diary, but I quickly became one. It was the only way to find out about Nina. Learning who she really was didn't change our idea of her. It was already too late for that. We would never be able to see her as just the granddaughter of some famous person. But it did have an effect. It turned out there was plenty of information out there about Nina Gabriellovich for someone who was willing to look for it. Far from being some random rich girl of the Roaring Twenties who had vanished into obscurity, like we first thought, she belonged to one of the most well-documented families of her day. I spent the next 25 years working on a book about Nina and the diary. It became a sort of part-time obsession. It was kind of fun at first, like a scavenger hunt, just gleaning whatever info I could find about her in music journals and Samuel Clemens biographies. There wasn't much. She was basically a footnote at the end of most books about Mark Twain. As far as the biographers were concerned, the story had ended just as Nina's life was beginning. Mark Twain had 3 daughters, all born here in Elmira, as well as a son who died in infancy. Tragically, 2 of his daughters also died in separate incidents during Twain's lifetime. His wife, the former Libby Langdon, passed away in 1904. By the time Twain himself died in 1910, his daughter Clara was the sole survivor of the Clemens family. Nina was born 4 months later, so Twain and Nina never met. This also meant that Nina grew up without any close relatives on her grandfather's side. She did, however, have several relatives on her grandmother's side. Libby's brother had a daughter, Julia, who married a man named Edward Loomis here in Elmira in 1902. They had 2 daughters. By 1924, that family, the Loomises, had settled in New Jersey and still maintained close contact with the Gabriellovich family in Detroit. During summer vacation in 1924, Nina and her family traveled to Europe by ocean liner. Along their way, they stopped off at New York City for a week. At this time, Nina recorded in her diary a visit to her New Jersey relatives, as well as her response to a famous film then in its first release.
Tuesday, June 17. We took a bus to Liberty Theater on 42nd Street to see Douglas Fairbanks, The Thief of Baghdad. I never saw such imagination acted out in a movie before. The story is about a thief who wants to marry the Princess of Baghdad. It shows how he fights a huge scaly dragon, goes under the sea, rides on a flying horse, and walks through the valley of fire. Mademoiselle and I think it is charming as well as amusing, and for a time you forget that you are in big, dirty New York where there is so much traffic. In the evening, my cousin Julia, Mrs. Loomis, telephoned and asked me to come early tomorrow to their farm. Wednesday, June 18. Bella, the old nurse, met me, and I went with her in the train to Murray Hills, and Olivia and Virginia were there to meet me. My, how they've changed since last year. They wear long dresses and have their hair up, and Virginia, who is 16 years old, is a good bit taller than Olivia, who is almost 19.
It's typical of Nina that she doesn't explain who these people are in the diary. To her, they were simply Cousin Julia and Cousin Edward. It wasn't until much later that I learned Cousin Edward was actually Edward Loomis, a railroad millionaire of the early 20th century.
They live in a lovely large white house and have 4 dogs, 2 horses, and 2 ponies. Cousin Julia and Miss Elmore had lunch with us, and in the afternoon we took a drive in the pony cart. We took turns driving and went through the beautiful, verdant, shady woods.
Elsewhere in the diary, Nina refers to her third cousins, Olivia and Virginia, as O and Sis, family nicknames. This is what they looked like in the 1920s. Olivia, as some of you may know, grew up to become Olivia Lada Markowski, a philanthropist and progressive activist based at Holiday Farm in New Jersey, which is where Nina visited them in 1924. Virginia was later known as Virginia Shifley. Olivia, Julia, and Edward are all buried in the Clemens Langdon plot in Woodlawn Cemetery here in Elmira. Once the internet came along, it became much easier to find not just information about Nina, but actual artifacts from the time of the diary. I started collecting everything I could find about Nina and her life. In my book, this information is presented alongside reproductions of the diary pages in an effort to reproduce Nina's world for the reader. This page, for example, includes a beautiful old postcard of the ship that Nina and her family took to Europe in 1924. In Germany's online National Archives, I even found photos of the Zeppelin that she saw over Berlin, taken on the very day she saw it. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In June of 1924, Nina and her family traveled to Europe by ocean liner. Nina's father had a series of concerts scheduled for the summer. The trip across the ocean took 9 days. The experience was much like a modern-day cruise ship. They passed the time playing games, having fancy dinners, and meeting fellow passengers. Nina recorded all this in her diary, and just as importantly, with her camera. Nina was a shutterbug for an early age, and a good one.
Friday, June 27th. With the help of Father, I made the acquaintance of 3 Japanese people whose signatures I wanted so badly. Their names are Baron Ishimoto, Baroness Ishimoto, and her sister, Miss Kei Hirota. They talk quite good English, and the 2 women are both pretty and intelligent. They, of course, have dark eyes, black hair, and a pretty olive-colored complexion. The Baron always has a pleasant smile on his face and is excellent at playing shuffleboard.
This was early in the era of consumer photography. Most of you probably remember a time when you had to take your film in to be processed before you could see your pictures. But in the 1920s, Nina had to take her entire camera into the shop for processing. The lab would open the camera in the darkroom, remove and process the film, and replace it with new film. In the 1924 diary, Nina often talks about the pictures that she's taken. For the first 20 years of my research, I found only a handful of Nina's photographs. I assumed that the rest had probably been destroyed or thrown away after she died. But in the early 2000s, the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, discovered that they had a huge trove of Nina's photos, including her 1924 photo album. And that included many of the pictures that she talks about taking in the diary. Believe me, I never thought I would see the Ishimotos with my own eyes. The Hartford Museum was generous enough to share these photos with me and to allow me to share them with you. Of course, in my research, I eventually found out how Nina's life ended. It turned out this was the part of the story that most Mark Twain scholars already knew. In fact, in some cases, it was the only thing they knew about Nina. Learning about her death was shattering enough. It was already like she was someone we knew. But learning about her life was worse. Alcoholic, drug-addicted, with mental illness, and a life that was somehow destitute in the midst of great wealth, like the Beals of Grey Gardens. Many of the obituaries in January 1966 mentioned her last words, said to a friend before she left the bar that night. Quote, "When I die, I want artificial flowers, jitterbug music, and a bottle of vodka at my grave." End quote. Some of the obituaries implied that this was a verbal suicide note, although we don't know, and will never know, if the overdose was accidental or deliberate. But as I began to explore the world of Twain's scholarship, we learned this was how most Twain scholars saw Nina. A tragic figure, unhappy, and unable to fulfill her potential, whatever it was. But that's not how we saw her. We saw the happy Nina, the Nina of the diary. And the thing is, we were both right. In Europe, the Gabriellovich family spent some time visiting Ossip's relatives who still lived on the continent. In her diary and photographs, Nina also documented Europe in the brief calm between the First and Second World Wars. In August, Nina and her mother visited an Austrian Gräfin, or countess, who had been a friend and supporter of Mark Twain during his European years in the 1890s.
Tuesday, August 5, Bad Ischl, Austria. We drove to the hotel where the Gräfin Wiedenbrock was awaiting us. We had a good lunch, and the Countess spoke of different musicians and friends of Mother. Then we walked up to where the Countess lives. It is beside the palace the Kaiser used to inhabit, and inside is the desk where he signed the fatal war agreement. We had tea, and the Gräfin's married daughter and her little 6-year-old girl took it with us.
So what happened to Nina? This became the foremost question for us after finding her obituary. As with any promising young person who came to a bad end, the answers are incomplete and unsatisfying. She graduated from her private girls' school in 1929. She went to New York City to attend Barnard College. It was in New York that Nina first began to hang out with actors and other artistic types. She also started to experiment with alcohol and drugs. These two facts may or may not have been related, but her parents certainly thought they were. This picture is from the Hartford collection of Nina's photographs. It's probably one of the last pictures of the whole family together. It may be the last picture. Ossip died of cancer in 1936. After he was gone, both Nina and Clara, her mother, seemed to become unmoored. First Clara and then Nina moved to California. That's where they spent the rest of their lives. Nina wanted to be an actress, and she did get some parts in traveling stage productions. But her behavior offstage was increasingly erratic. In letters, friends said she was underweight and smoked too much. In her later diaries, there are signs of emotional instability, aside from her increasing substance abuse problems. Both Nina's mother and her grandmother, Livy, were emotionally fragile and prone to nervous attacks. Clara would periodically check into sanitariums to settle her nerves. These sanitariums were more like health spas. In later years, Nina would also stay in sanitariums, but these were more like the modern-day facilities that we know. But she continued to drink when she got out, so any successes were short-lived. In the 1940s, Nina's mother Clara married another Russian musician, Jacques Samosad. Jacques was a cad, to put it charitably, who saw the Clemens fortune as a way to pay off his vast gambling debts. Nina moved to Los Angeles and had plastic surgery on her nose as part of an effort to get into the movies. She started to call herself Nina Clemens around this time. She joked that it was because she couldn't pronounce Gabriellovich. There was talk of casting her in a movie version of Twain's The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg, but she soon grew less interested in acting and more interested in the wild life that she was living. Even without the money from the Mark Twain Trust, she had regular income from her father's estate, so she never had to work. Clara was famously judicious about keeping up the name and image of Mark Twain. For example, she withheld some of Twain's racier works from publication for decades. The one thing Clara couldn't control was Nina, which must have been especially galling for her. Meanwhile, Clara was blind to her second husband's scandals. She actually auctioned off her house and her own collection of Mark Twain memorabilia in the 1950s to help him pay his gambling debts. Then they moved to San Diego to be closer to the Del Mar racing track. Nina's mother, Clara, died in 1962. Nina's downward spiral continued to the point that she requested to be placed under a conservatorship. The concept of conservatorship has been in the news recently, so some of you may be familiar. Basically, someone else is placed in charge of making all important life decisions with a conservatee who is considered legally unsound to make those decisions. By her request, Nina's financial decisions were made by her bank. Her conservator in all other matters was her friend and attorney, Rudy's grandfather, Al Matthews. Al also helped her to successfully contest her mother's will, which would have cut off all income from the Twain estate. Nina started work on an autobiography. The title itself is heartbreaking, A Life Alone. The manuscript has never been recovered. She continued to check in and out of sanitariums in California to dry out. When she was home, she had a live-in nurse as part of her conservatorship. She resented this measure and would often check into a motel across the street to avoid him. That is why, on January 16, 1966, she was found in the motel rather than her own apartment. The autopsy report listed the cause of death as overdose of barbiturates. Whether it was an accident or suicide is much more debatable, and even the coroner's office was not sure. The little girl Nina, our time-traveling pen pal, seemed to be completely gone by the end of her life. But that was not so. My quest to find information about Nina eventually took me around the country. Detroit, California, Hartford, Missouri, and of course, New York. And every so often, I would catch a glimpse of her. The little girl who loved travel and practical jokes. The one who empathized with the poor in Detroit winters and took pictures everywhere she went. That person definitely faded over the years of a very hard life, but she never went away entirely.
Monday, June 16. I woke up at around 6 o'clock New York time, and looking out of the window beheld a picturesque sight. Right beside us flowed the broad Hudson, just as quiet as it could be, except when a swiftly passing motorboat left a path of ripples behind it on the pinkish blue water. Beyond were endless forests, where here and there were dotted small houses, and behind that the green curved hills. We had our breakfast on the train and arrived in New York Station at 10:24. I love the racket that goes on at any station. Conductors whistling, porters running, men calling, taxi doors banging, the noise of the engine, and a dozen other things.
Other than her birth and her death, Nina had one real moment of national fame. It happened in 1935 when she was 25 years old. She was invited to Hannibal, Missouri to dedicate the Mark Twain Zephyr, a locomotive named after her famous grandfather. This is when train travel was still the most prestigious way to get across the country. So the debut of a new train was like the launch of a ship. She even broke a champagne bottle across the nose of the engine. She posed for pictures with kids dressed like Tom, Huck, and Becky from Huckleberry Finn. Afterwards, there was a fancy dinner party where she was treated like a princess. The other guests included Harry Truman, then just a senator from Missouri. All these pictures are from the Hannibal Public Library's great webpage about the event. But this one is my favorite. This one seems like the happy Nina, the Nina from the diary, the Nina that only we knew. That's one reason I call my book The Lost Diary. The other reason, it seems like it really was lost. There are other diaries, 20 years worth of them, at a university archive in Provo, Utah, where scholars have studied them from time to time. Nobody's really sure why the 1924 diary didn't wind up there as well. But I have a supposition based on what we do know. I think that Nina kept the 1924 diary separate from her other diaries at the end of her life and maybe for a long time before. That's why it wound up with her personal effects that went to Al Matthews. I have to wonder if 1924 represented a sort of golden year in Nina's life. Maybe it's not a coincidence that the 1924 diary contains no signs of mental illness, no family strife, which is rare for the Clemenses at any point, and takes place at an age when most people are just starting to assert their individual personalities separate from family and community. Maybe the diary was a way for an older, sadder Nina to remember who she was, or at least who she had been.
Friday, September 26th. At 6 minutes to 10, the wonderful Zeppelin that is to fly to America appeared. Crowds of people filled the streets, and many were stationed on the roofs of buildings supplied with moving picture cameras. The silver-gray Zeppelin glided gracefully along, so gracefully that it seemed a mere phantom of the air. 4 times we saw it, and each time the spectators cheered and waved their handkerchiefs. In the afternoon, Fräulein and I shopped, and at 7:15 left for Father's second and last concert. At first, I also sat in the Landecker box, but later, as more and more people came, I joined Fräulein and Uncle George, who sat below. Father's playing was marvelous, and so was his directing, but it must have been an awful strain, because his visage was as white as snow. After the last piece, he was called out 6 times. The populace were begeistered. Who do you suppose were there? Dr. Haas, Mrs. Haas, and Herr Helmut Gorina. Imagine. Fräulein and I walked home. I got to bed at 10:30.
After The Diary of a Young Girl was published in the 1950s, millions mourned its young author, Anne Frank, and rightfully so. But who mourned for Nina? I did, because I knew her without knowing who she was. Because I met her, knew her, and cared about her before I saw the name S.L. Clemens. This is the passage that concludes my book. There were no tourists on that Wednesday in June of 1999, thank God. In fact, the cemetery was all but deserted. I walked up on the pavestones surrounding the 2 large standing monuments. There in front of me was the grave of Mark Twain, and I hardly noticed it. Beside him were his wife Livy and the 2 daughters who had preceded Twain in death. Beyond them, just outside the flagstones, were the markers for Clara and Ossip. And off to the side of them, separate and alone, was Nina. I started to cry. It occurred to me that I might be the only person since 1966 to mourn her, to look at that gravestone and weep. Considering how her life ended, maybe I was one of the only people ever to mourn for her. That clever little girl, so full of life and joy. That sad, lonely woman, inheritor of an impossible legacy. Against the odds, she had connected with someone and changed lives long after she was gone. After a while, I went and got the items that I'd brought with me. Your last words, Nina, I took them to heart. When I die, I want artificial flowers, jitterbug music, and a bottle of vodka at my grave. I cried as I placed the articles against the gravestone. She could have said it as a joke, not knowing the overdose waited only hours later. It might not have meant anything to her, but it meant something to me. And I had to wonder, was I the only person ever to honor her whimsical last wish? Was she there? Was she watching? If she was, then they all were. Ossip and Clara, all the Langdons and Clemenses, and old Sam himself. What would they make of the skinny hippie at the end of the millennium who stands at the grave of the last Clemens and weeps? Briefly, I also wondered about the next student, tourist, or cemetery keeper who came to the Clemens plot, what they would think when they saw the swing CD, the plastic flowers, and the bottle of vodka sitting at her grave. I would never know. But I did know one thing for sure. I was so overcome with emotion at seeing Nina's grave, I hardly even noticed Twain's plot there next to it. It might have been the first time in history Nina overshadowed her famous grandfather.
It would be worth mountains more to me to feel that people love me for being a wonderful person than for being the greatest artist. However, it's very amusing when you stop to think of it. If people asked what you were doing, and you weren't doing anything and answered, "Oh, I'm just living the life of a truly great person," I'm sure that people would laugh. You couldn't say such a thing, and yet, why not? Isn't it possible to be great without doing anything?